What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. For this week's video, I thought we would do an old Candlestick phone. Not only did I think it would just be fun to make for this week's video, but it's also fairly beginner friendly, so for anybody that's new or relatively new to Maya or Substance Painter, hopefully this video is going to be a little bit easier to follow along. Alright, let's just get started. Okay, so starting off with the cylinder, I'm going to start blocking out the main shapes. Now I'm going to start with the bottom and work my way up just because it's one of the largest shapes in the scene. And all I'm really going to do is just delete these top faces and start extruding this edge and scaling them differently depending on what I want the shape to be. So for these first three shapes, it's going to be the exact same process over and over again with just extruding this edge. So let's just go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to quickly add a few bevels to some of these edges, but keep in mind you don't have to do this depending on what your model is going to be used for, especially if you want to have a lower poly and a higher poly model. That workflow is really good for video games and you can bring both the models right into Substance Painter. So what I would do if you're going to use this for a video game or an asset like that, I would just keep one of these low poly and not bevel the edges, and then once that model is complete you can move back and start beveling some edges to create a higher poly model as well. So just keep that in mind. I'm only going to be creating the higher poly model here, and I'm not going to go too crazy, but I just wanted to point that out that you don't necessarily have to bevel everything. Alright, so now we have those 3 main wood pieces done, we can move on to this little top metal piece. Now, I could have done this much simpler. There was one reference that had basically a sphere, and all you could do is just select the bottom pieces and extrude them outwards. But I wanted to make it a little bit more complex. One of the references had a cylinder shape that was basically attached to another cylinder shape below it. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're just going to select 2 cylinders, position one horizontally and one vertically, and then I can go delete these faces so I can bridge them together. Now, to make this work, you have to make sure you have the correct amount of vertices on each object. So if you look at the bottom shape, it has 20 vertices after I delete those top faces, and that top one only has 10. So what I have to do is go add a few small edge loops around so it has the correct amount of vertices. That way when I bridge them together, it has the correct amount of points to connect itself to. And then I'm just going to add a few edge loops in between them, and then when I hit 3 on my keyboard, I can smooth it out to take a look at the shape. And then at this point, it's just a matter of going in and refining the shape until I get something I'm happy with. So here I just quickly go in and bevel some of these edges, just trying and experimenting with a few things, trying to figure out exactly how I want this to look, but I end up removing this soon enough, so and just keep that in mind. If you're following along, you don't have to do this part. I remove it in a few minutes. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to go ahead with the target weld tool and fix up those bevels I created earlier. Alright, so we're looking good. Now I just have to finish up the shape. So I'm just going to go ahead to the bottom, double click that edge, and I can start extruding that to finish off the shape. Alright, so now I'm just going to go add a few more bevels and then I can start cleaning up this shape a little bit more to get it a little bit closer to what I had in mind. Alright, we're looking good. Next up is just moving on to the top piece of the phone. So I'm going to start off with another cylinder and start blocking out those shapes. Alright, we're looking good and things are slowly coming together. Now I just noticed in my reference that middle piece we were working on earlier, one side has a screw on it and the other side's just a rounded beveled edge basically. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go back into that shape, cut it in half so I can bevel out one edge to make it all rounded. And now to the opposite side, I'm going to start off with another cylinder so I can make a little screw. Alright, so that top piece is all finished. Now we can move on to do that dial. So I'm going to start off with another cylinder so I can start blocking out that shape. Alright, so now our main shape is blocked out. Now we can move on to the little cutouts. That's going to be where the numbers are going to go. And that's going to be done through a boolean. So I'm going to go ahead and create another cylinder. Just drag down those subdivisions. I don't want it to be too high in poly. That way, once the boolean's done and created, I'll have so many vertices to combine and attach and it can get quite messy. So I'm going to go with this 12-sided cylinder. And I'm going to scale that nice and small and play around with the shape until I find something I'm happy with. Now all I'm doing here is just changing the pivot point to the center of the cylinder that's below it. That way when I rotate them around, it's going to be correctly in the center of that shape. So here I'm just scaling it a little bit smaller than the previous one. I'm repositioning that pivot point, and then once I press Ctrl D to duplicate it, I'm going to make it, just give it a really nice tight space, and then I can press Shift D to redo that move over and over again until I have all of those buttons around the outside of that cylinder. And once I'm happy with that, I can select all of those cylinders, combine them into one object, and then I can just boolean out a hole into that cylinder. I want wanted to create one extra edge loop, so I'm just going to delete those faces and I can extrude them in. That way when I do create those booleans, it's just going to be much easier for me to attach those vertices since there's a closer point to it, rather than dragging all those vertices into the center of the cylinder and have a lot of points going into the exact same vertice. It can just get messy. So by creating that extra edge loop that's closer to those booleans, it's just going to make my shape a little bit more clean. Now once that boolean's created, I just need to go with the target weld tool and start combining or attaching some of these vertices so they're not just floating on the side of the edges. Now a lot of these vertices aren't going to have any points attached yet. We're going to do that afterwards with the multi-cut tool, but for now we're just going to go in with the target weld and just attach all of those loose vertices. Now once those are all connected, I'm just going to add one extra edge loop on the side here just so these boolean holes on the outsides have something to connect to. And then I can use that multi-cut tool to start connecting all of my vertices together. So all of those points and those vertices that don't have anything are just floating there in space. We just want to connect them to somewhere. So I'm just going to go through and speed this up a little bit as I'm just connecting all of these points. And the goal here, of course, is to try to keep it in quads or triangles. So all those faces that have more than 4 points, I'm going to add an extra edge loop with that multi-cut tool just to make it into a triangle or a quad. Alright, so that shape is basically good to go. Now if you did notice, I did miss a few vertices. I think I missed 2 of them in total, but I caught that while I was doing the UVing process, so I do tackle that later on and I fix it up, so don't worry if you did notice that. But we're basically good to go and moving on to the next part, and that's basically creating those little numbers, cylinders that are inside of those boolean holes that have the numbers on them. So I'm just going to go ahead with another cylinder, scale that nice and small, and I can fit that right inside. Alright, so the dial is in place. Now I'm just going to play around with the shape a little bit. Alright, so next up is moving on to the little piece that's holding up the earpiece on the phone, and that's just going to be a few small cylinders basically. Now to start it off, I just scaled one cylinder really small and attached that right onto the side of the phone, but for the other one I could have just created a few cylinders and bridged them together. There's a few different ways of tackling this, but I decided to create an EP curve tool so I can just create a curve, and once I was happy with the shape of that curve I can just use a sweep mesh tool and turn that line into some geometry. So it was just the quickest way I thought of at the moment to create this. Like I said, there's so many different ways you can go about creating these shapes, but for some reason I just decided to use the curve tool, so let's go ahead and create that. And once that line's in place, I can go ahead and cap off the end and then double click the edge to give it a nice bevel so it's rounded. And then using the duplicate special tool, I can just basically mirror that shape over and then attach them together. And then next up was just the earpiece itself, and that's just a few cylinders, so we're going to go ahead and start blocking that out. Alright, so we're almost done the modeling. We just need to create that cord that attaches from the earpiece to the phone itself. And we're going to do that through a sweep mesh, just like we did previously to that metal piece that's holding the earpiece. The exact same process, we're going to create an EP curve tool, and once I'm happy with it, then create a sweep mesh to create that wire. So let's go ahead and start creating that. And just like that, we have a wire. Now before we wrap up the model, I'm just going to go modify a few of the shapes on the phone. Alright, so the phone is almost wrapped up. We just have a little bit more work to do. So next up is just jumping on the bottom part that's underneath the phone. That's just simple. It's just a large cylinder that's scaled nice and small with a few little feet on there as well. And you're not going to see much of this in the model, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm not going to go crazy with detail. So we're just going to really quickly start blocking out those shapes. Alright, and that's a wrap on the modeling part. So really quickly, I'm just going to show you the UVs and how exactly I did those. I ended up going with 2 different textures, and honestly I could have done one, but I just decided to split it up into 2. So the first texture is just the top piece in the dial. I just wanted to get the most out of the texture, so I decided to split it up. And then the second texture is just all the other parts, so the middle, the phone, and the wires. It's nice and easy, pretty straightforward. Now it's time to jump into Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, I can load in my FBX from Maya. Alright, so once that model is loaded in, we can go over to our texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, and then I can choose my output size. I chose 4K, and then make sure to check that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, and then you can bake out your textures. So I'm going to start off with my texture 2, just because it's those larger objects in the first pieces I modeled. I just think it would make more sense to start there. So I'm going to go ahead over to my Smart Materials, and I'm going to choose one of those wood textures, and then I can just open up that folder and start tweaking some of those settings. Alright, so once I'm happy with that base color for that wood texture, I just want to go add some nice grain texture on top of that. And I know there's another material, another smart material that has some really nice wood grains. So I'm just going to go ahead and hide this folder, just drag on that other material so I can go select that wood grain pattern texture, and I can just copy that over to this current folder. Now that I have that pattern texture applied to this folder, I can just go in and start tweaking some of those settings, like the orientation of those grains, just so it looks more fitting on the model. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to add a little bit more detail to this model. And there's a few ways I'm going to do this. So the first one is I'm just going to go over and add another fill layer, switch that over to a black mask, and then I can add a generator. I'm just going to go down to add a generator, and I can choose one of these edge metal wares. Basically, it's just going to give me a little bit more edge wear on my model, and I can just go in and tweak some of those settings and parameters depending on how I want that edge wear to show on the model. And then once I'm happy with that, I can add another fill layer, switch that over to a black mask as well. But this time I'm going to go over to my masks tab in Substance Painter, and I can choose one of these masks. I'm going to choose this surface rust detail. I can drag that right onto my fill layer, and then I can tweak some of those settings and colors depending on how much rust and how much detail I want over top of my material. So I'm just going to play around with some of these masks and a few of these settings until I find something that I'm happy with. Alright, so things are starting to look good. Now it's time to move on to the other meshes. So next up is this metal gold material that's on this phone. So we're just going to go over to the Smart Material tab, and I can select this bronze armor material that already comes preset in Substance. Then I can just click and drag that right onto my mesh, and then it's just a matter of tweaking some of these settings and colors until I find something I'm happy with. So for this little screw indent, I originally wanted to find an alpha that was already in Substance Painter just to imprint onto the metal, but none of these were working for me, and just to make this really quick, I decided to just use a standard brush, the square brush, and after adding a fill layer and adding a height channel, all I did was drag that height slider down and then just basically imprint some squares in the shape of what a cross pattern would look like, just so it looks like there's an imprinted cross right into the metal. Alright, so next up is moving on to the rubber pieces, and that's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to use some of those built-in rubber materials that already come in Substance. So moving on to the Smart Materials tab, I can go select this rubber dry material and then just drag that right onto my mesh. So I'm going to be reusing this wood and golden materials on the other texture. So just before moving on to those, I'm just going to refine these ones a little bit more to get them a little bit closer to what I had in mind. Alright, so now moving on to the other texture, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to copy over that gold and wooden material just so we can reuse them on this texture. And then I'm going to spend the next little bit just tweaking some of these settings to make them fit these meshes a little bit better. Alright, so next up was moving on to that metal imprint that's on the front of this dial. So all I did for this was create another fill layer, open up that bronze armor folder, and just drag in that fill layer right below that base color. Then I can switch off all of those channels since all I need is just a height channel applied. and then just slide that slider down depending on how much of an imprint I want on that metal mesh. And then I just quickly jumped onto Google. I just found some old vintage crest symbol on Google Images. I just saved that as an image and quickly threw that into Photoshop just so I can invert the colors to make it black and white. Then all I have to do is export that image and drag it right into Photoshop and set that as an alpha. And all I have to do is basically go back to that fill layer, switch that to a black mask, and then just paste on that alpha directly onto that mesh. And then here I'm just quickly adding another fill layer like we did earlier so I can go apply another mask just to add a little bit more detail on top of that material. Alright, so we're almost done the model. Next up is just doing all those little numbers. So that's pretty easy. I'm just going to go back to my Smart Materials tab and select the plastic material to apply to all of those meshes. Once I'm happy with that, I can go choose one of those plastic materials. I could choose a fill layer as well, but I'm just make my life easy. I always select one of these plastic materials, assign that to a black mask, and then I just need to go find an alpha that's in Substance Painter just to make my life that much easier. I'm gonna find a font that's relatively fitting to this phone, and then I can start pasting on all those numbers all around that dial. And just like we did the other rubber materials, I'm just going to go copy that same material over to assign to that top mesh. And then I'm just going to tweak some of those settings, and then just like the others, I'm going to add another fill layer so I can go choose a mask to add a little bit more detail on top of it. So now quickly jumping into the renderer to see how things are looking, I'm just going to take away that background plane to have a plain color, and just change that environment map to have a different lighting source. And things are looking pretty good. One of the things I like to also change is the focal length in Substance Painter. It tends to be relatively low at 17, just standard, so I bring that up usually to 35 or 50, but in this case I'm just going to bump that up to 35, and then just jump back into the editor so I can start tweaking some of these materials. So once I was adjusting some of those settings and fixing some of those materials, I actually realized I totally forgot to apply material to that bottom mesh on the bottom of my phone. So really quickly, I'm just going to go over to my Smart Materials tab, choose one of those plastic textures, and I can apply it to that mesh. Alright, so now jumping back into the renderer once again just to take a look at the model, and there's a few small little things I want to fix up before wrapping it up, so I'm just going to quickly go ahead and just modify a few of these textures and settings and just get a little bit closer to what I had in mind. And that's a wrap on this week's model. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Also, if you'd like to support the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon account, which is in the description below. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.